Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I am Joe Devine, and I'm joined now by Alex Stewart.
Hello.
Hello. Today we spoke to a very interesting man with a very interesting name, Charles Gould. What a great name. Isn't it a good name?
Yes.
Charles's story is equally as interesting as his name. Charles started a company called Retexo. You don't need to roll the R, but I think it sounds better if you do. Retexo. Alex, in bullet point form, can you tell me what Retexo do, por favor?
So Retexo aid in the recruitment and strategizing of professionals in football clubs, looking particularly at things like sporting directors, heads of academy and coaches.
Are you reading that from somewhere, or is that just literally how you talk?
That's literally how I talk.
Such a weirdo.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on, Mr. Wikipedia.
And they do this by conducting network analysis.
Do you speak to your mother like that? Do go on. His
Yes.
job's very interesting.
She did tell me yesterday that I was very weird, which is not. It's not what you want to hear from your mum, really, is it? Like, yeah, no,
It's
you'd
what
like
I want
that.
to hear
You're
from your
weird.
mum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, he helps clubs find the right people, and he does that on the basis of who those people have developed and worked with previously. So it kind of builds up to on-pitch data and is all the kind of supplementary stuff that goes into producing players, and he's mining that for efficiencies in the market.
Yeah, I tell you what, all the talk about the big networks and the big matrices that they are creating, i.e. trying to find, if there's 50 famous players who've come from one particular area, who was the coach or who was the scout or whoever who oversaw all of that, and trying to find little nuggets within the marketplace, I suppose. But hey, Charles explains it much better than I have, and just a little bit less well than Alex did with his weird dictionary voice. Anyway, if you like to read things that are very, very good, you should visit theathletic.com/Tifo, and you can get a 30-day free trial or a indeterminable amount of time free trial, I think it's 30 days, to explore everything that The Athletic has to offer. And I mentioned this actually when we had Heels Brower on from Sci Sports a while ago, or Sports Sci Sport, I can't remember which way around. Anyway, Adam Crafton, journalist for The Athletic, spoke to him about a long piece of data in football. If you haven't read that, you really should. It's fantastic. And generally speaking, there's quite a lot of usage of that throughout various different articles on the site, isn't there, Alex? Are there any other data pieces that jump to mind that may be of interest and tangentially related to this podcast?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tom Werville has been working with various of the beat writers to do squad depth work on the basis of, where is this team strong or weak, looking at who's in the playing squad. So it's a nice kind of use of data to build a profile of clubs, which will presumably then, be the sort of thing that the club is thinking about heading into a transfer window, whenever that will be.
Yeah, there's a whole world out there, and I can hear it through my window now with that police car. Anyway, read, better yourselves, better yourselves. And you can do that by visiting theathletic.co.uk. No, .com, sir, /Tifo. For the time being, let us leave you in the warm embrace of Charles Gould and Retexo. Say it with me, Alex. Retexo. Come on.
Retexo.
And you went to a private school. You can't even roll your R's, and you went to a never mind. Here's Charles Gould from Retexo. Charles, can I start by asking you to explain to me what makes Retexo, your company, different from another data analysis outfit like Opta or StatsBomb, for example?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we tried to do to differentiate ourselves from other data providers at the time that we incorporated the business last year was to focus as much as possible in the initial stages on the qualitative data around both players but also technical staff. We felt that looking at the market, there's a ton of focus on what happens on the pitch, which of course is the manifestation of which is where the success needs to be, but we feel is the manifestation of thousands of different variables prior to that, and those are the things that we were most interested in looking at. So what we did was to focus a lot on who these players are, where they come from, which coaches they've worked with, which scouts have found them, which people within clubs have committed money to buying them, and who has allowed these people to be on the pitch at the time that we're actually watching the game. Because we feel that just analysing what's happening in game is ignoring all of the different things that go into those players being available for that moment. The other thing, which I think is super important, is when we look at when we talk about analytics, that almost always means analytics of players. But I think equally as important is performing analytics on the technical staff that work with the players. Because if the right structure isn't in place at a club, then it's very unstable, and we see many examples of how that doesn't benefit the on-pitch results. So we focus as much on analysing the technical staff as we do the players.
Right, that's interesting. I mean, it's funny when you talk about it that way, because as a sort of casual observer of statistics and the use of metrics in sport, it strikes me that there are many intangibles that would either be impossible to collate or record, at the current time, maybe in the future, or that are things that I'm not even sure how you would consider recording. It sounds like you are describing some of the things that are on the way to that. What sort of examples would they be, Charles?
Well, in isolation, they're intangible. You're absolutely right. But the closer you look at groups of different clubs or groups of different operators, the more relationships you tend to see in that data. So, for example, if you want to talk about academy production in clubs worldwide, I did a big project last year for Real Madrid, who were looking to restructure their academy. And one of the things we wanted to do was understand which clubs are running academies on a proficient scale. So what we did was to look at every single player that had played a minimum of Europa League football over the last decade, and we traced those players back to the academy they came from in their home country. And where we saw particular academy output, we were able to identify who had been running the academies of the most proficient clubs. And what we then did was to dig into why those people were the ones who were being successful. So what structures did they employ beneath them? What were their reporting lines? What were the business mechanisms of the departments that they ran? And very quickly, we started noticing that, for example, clubs that have elections and therefore a high turnover of staff tend to have weaker academies because there's less process in place. We saw that academy directors who had more access to either the president or the chairman or the CEO or whoever's running the organization tended to be more successful because by definition it was something that was taken more seriously by the club. So there are a lot of intangibles around people themselves and their skills, but also there are a ton of very tangible things around how those people are deployed when they're at clubs.
Can I ask, a bit like in Football Manager, where each different edition of the game or each new generation has a particular young player or maybe a coach that stands out for reasons that only the creators of the game could explain? In your early workings, in this research that you just went through, as you described last year, was there a particular name of someone, a coach at an academy, that stood out to you or that became your jaws?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that the two most interesting markets we found were, to call Serbia and Croatia one market is not entirely accurate, but former Yugoslav nations were performing very well. The other one, which is just astonishing given its population, is Uruguay. And when we looked at which Uruguayan clubs had provided the most Uruguayan players to the top 5 European leagues, it wasn't one of the bigger clubs like Peñarol or Nacional. It was actually a smaller club in Montevideo called Defensor. And there's a guy who's now become the sporting director, who previously ran the academy for many, many years. His name is Fernando Fadue, and he's someone whose name I'd never heard of and who I rarely hear about, but I think should be credited with some phenomenal work. So that's just one example.
Does he know that you talk about him, Charles? Does he know he features in your life in such a powerful way?
I don't think he knows to what extent, no. But we have had several conversations together. He's a great guy.
Without giving away trade secrets or anything, how do you go about finding out and building these networks? Because presumably, for one thing, how a club operates its academy is presumably relatively secretive, because they're doing things they don't want other clubs to find out. But also you're relying on data, I'm assuming, from things like Transfermarkt or whatever, and particularly when you start delving into smaller clubs, some of that stuff may be inaccurate. So how do you go about harvesting those two types of information?
Sure. Well, I think personally that I've got a big advantage in that in my former life, I was an executive recruiter. In fact, I should probably drop the word executive because these guys aren't executives. But the whole nature of that business is that everybody you meet is theoretically a candidate for something at some point. And therefore, they tend to be very open with you about what their roles entail, about how their teams work, and about what the deficiencies are in the organizations that they work in. So I think that on starting this company, there was a lot of initial data and context that existed for me to be able to obtain this type of information. I think that what's most interesting is talking to people, but also talking to clubs themselves. Every single club is relatively open to at least having a discussion around how they could improve the technical side of their clubs, and therefore are usually willing to share a fair amount of information about how those departments are structured. And actually, one of your points that you made about clubs being secretive, I don't see that as much as you might think. I also think that there are far fewer trade secrets than clubs would like you to believe. We actually found that a number of the 52 clubs that I mentioned earlier who had been highly proficient at player development, particularly in Europe, were proficient in spite of themselves and in spite of the poor practices that they had in place at the time. So it's a far less guarded secret, if you like, than you might think.
So does that mean you can lay the credit for player development really quite emphatically at the feet of an individual in a setup, or to what degree are you having to say, well, this coach is clearly a very talented coach and they're very good at working with young players because we can see who moves through it, but we need to contextualize that by looking at the whole setup and the funding, and that they've got a very supportive director who believes in academy stuff. How do you make those two things distinct or pull them apart to work out who's really the reason for success?
Sure, no, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, there's no one person that's ever responsible for the development of a player. But if you assume that people presiding over academy operations that are highly proficient are at least not bad at their job, then what we can do is start interviewing those people and understand what the structure of the team is that they've built, or what restrictions have been on them that dictated that the team has to look how it looks. And then we can understand, it's very easy for us to then find out who was working with them, who was working for them, whether they considered any particular innovations from club level. For example, do the academy players have access to the first team players? Do they eat in the same dining room? Do they train on the same pitches? Are the scouts that recruit youth players able to negotiate their own deals, or does it all have to be done by someone more senior at the club? There are lots of little nuances that exist that allow academy recruitment to be more agile, but the recruitment is really only one part. And what's interesting is we felt at the beginning that recruitment would be 90% of how proficient an academy was, because obviously if you're not getting the right players in, you're not producing the right results. But it's also very interesting looking at what the methodology is and what the training structures are within those academies, because you can also look at a club like Athletic Bilbao, who, as you know, only recruit players from the Basque country in Spain. And it's very unusual that a club that's recruiting players only from such a small region produces so many fantastic academy graduates. In fact, I think the year that Kepa went to Chelsea and that Laporte went to Man City, they became the first club in history to sell 2 academy graduates for over 50 million euros, which is pretty phenomenal. So I think that the coaching, once the players have been admitted into the academy, is as important as the initial recruitment. And then the third piece to that is what's the pathway that's provided by the club. So do these players have access to first team football if they're good enough? And I know that every club says yes to that, but that's simply not the case. And so if you look at a club like Lyon, for example, who historically have also recruited close to home, and so if you think of notable graduates they've had over the last, say, 15 years, like Benzema, Lacazette, Umtiti, Fekir, Tolisso, these are guys who, whether or not they were born in France, grew up around the Lyon area. And they were all given access to first team football, to European competition, and able to really show that they were able to cut it at that level. So in short, I'd say that the three things that matter are the recruitment, the methodology, and then the pathway. And then somebody who recognizes those three things, I think is off to a good start.
Just to touch briefly on the Lyon thing, and also you've got like the Ile-de-France region around Paris, for example, as well, and you've mentioned Serbia and Croatia already, and Uruguay. Are you also delving in almost to a kind of micro level to look at what access these kids have before they even join an academy to particular types of pitches or sports clubs locally, or whether schools have a particularly high standard of coaching before they get sucked into the professional matrix? Do you go in that granular level of detail?
As much as possible, yeah. So for example, if we were doing a study on the area that, let's say the Lazio region in Italy, the area around, the area that Rome is a part of, what we would do is to look at all of the particular football schools in Rome that players have come from. So all of the guys who are currently playing in the Primavera teams at Lazio and Roma, it's just where we would start, obviously, because they're local. We would look at what the career trajectories had been for those guys and which associations or entities they'd been affiliated with prior to being scouted by the professional club. And what you realize is that, you know, it's usually only a handful of smaller football schools that tend to provide these types of players to the professional clubs. So it's quite easy to dig into that if we're looking at regions in isolation. Beyond that, we're trying our best at the moment to understand, you know, what kind of infrastructure is in place within those football schools, so that we can try and assign, you know, if we look at a number of players who've graduated or come out of a particular school that play in a certain way, we'd like to understand what kind of facilities that school had that perhaps contributed to them having certain physical or technical characteristics. So that's something we're absolutely focused on now. But just given the global scale of this world, it's hard to pinpoint in too detailed a way right now.
And in terms of collecting information about players that are part of academies, for example, do you ever take it further than the football itself? Do you ever try to collect information relating to their home life or their characteristics, for example? Because I know that these are things that in recruitment circles are difficult to translate to the more statistical, analytical way of approaching things, and is still more part of the kind of the old boys network, as it's called. You know, your manager calls your old manager's friend who worked with the player 5 years ago, and he tells you that, you know, he loves going out on a Friday night or something. Is there any way of collating that information? Do you do that?
We don't do that specifically, and it's very hard to do that if you don't know the people involved. One of the areas that we do use quite a lot is to talk to the agents of particular players, because they're often party to a lot of information that either they don't want the clubs knowing specifically, or that they hold that the clubs don't, for whatever reason that might be. The difficulty with that is, of course, agents all have an agenda, which is to paint their player in the most favourable light, and to have a vested interest in doing that. So we find that can be a useful outlet for information, but only relating to certain aspects. Beyond that, I think it's much more word of mouth, and unless we had a specific mandate to focus on personal lives or family backgrounds or family disciplines, then it's probably something that's harder for us to address.
Okay, so this is, I mean, it's quite a unique angle to take certainly in terms of the people that we've spoken to, and it's clear that you have an approach that is separable from these other companies. What is your commercial model? How does this work? I mean, presumably you work with clubs, right? How do you do that?
Well, we have two types of clients right now, and obviously the plan is to grow. But in short, we work with ownership groups, and that's ownership groups that are either pre or post acquisition. So one of the benefits actually of me being based in the US is that I know a lot of the groups that have designs on entering European football through either an investment or an acquisition. And a lot of the time, these are people that may have been owners of American sports franchises, or they might be people who are businessmen with European roots and just like football. But in any event, they're rarely people that really understand it at a granular level. And I think there have been so many examples of particularly Americans having their fingers burnt by making investments in Europe that have gone south, that there's a good market for us to advise these people ahead of time on, if they do make the acquisition, what sorts of people they should have in their structure to realize the vision that they're hoping for. And that normally will include very high level personnel. So that might be a CEO, that might be a sporting director or director of football, and that might be a head coach. And so it's easy for us to run analytics on a number of different people that we feel would suit their objectives. So that's the first part. Obviously, post-acquisition groups are in place and they have a defined vision for what it is that they want to achieve. The other is that we work for clubs individually. And as you know, on the continent, there are many clubs that don't have ownership models but are fan-owned. And regardless of that, we'll work directly with a club that is owned by an individual anyway. And what we'll do is we'll partner with the club. We don't have any interest in prescribing any of our methodology to clubs, because I think that if you've got two different clubs that are looking to recruit a player in the same position, it's very unlikely that, unless that player is extraordinary, it's very unlikely that they'll be going after the same types of players, because they've got different budgets, they've got different playing styles, the coach is different. So we will only ever partner with clubs in order to help them. And once we understand what their objectives are in the recruitment of a certain player or of a player in a certain position, we'll help them to build statistical models around the performance of players that they're interested in, but we won't actively bring them recommendations.
On the first point there, the pre-acquisition, or I suppose it doesn't have to be pre-acquisition if a club is looking for a new sporting director or academy head, for example. Let's just pick a hypothetical here and say it's a major club and they've come to you to help, appoint a new sporting director or academy head. Can you take us through the process? What would that look like?
Of course, yeah. So let's talk about a sporting director, because we focused quite a lot on academies so far. So with a sporting director, I would be bold enough to say that the majority of sporting directors have done a bad job, and a lot of the time these people are extremely empowered, have access to funds, and end up wasting a lot of money. And there are many people that you see bouncing around the same job for different clubs, and they don't really stay anywhere for more than 18 months or sometimes even less, which doesn't necessarily reflect on them, but it's much harder to leave a tangible legacy if you're moving that much, for whatever the reason might be. So I think what's really important, once you've exhausted the qualitative subjects, so that might be which languages do they speak and what nationality are they, I think then, you really want to dig into the granularity of it. So what we would do is to build a model showing all of the players that person has recruited, not just in the role of a sporting director, but in a previous role as a scout, because 90% of the time these guys have been scouts that become sporting directors. So we would specifically be looking at leagues and countries that they recruit from. So is this guy a specialist in recruiting players from France or from Italy, whatever it might be? What kind of age are the players that this person normally recruits? So do they buy young players with high resale potential, or do they buy, quote unquote, the finished article? How much money does this person typically spend on players? And part of that's dictated by the previous point. A lot of the time, if a player is young, that they might not be as expensive. And then how much money has the club received through the sale of these players? And that's a legacy that a sporting director leaves, whether or not he's still at the club at the time that one of the players he's bought is ultimately sold. Because if he can point to the fact that he's made money for the club, then that's fine. It doesn't matter whether he was still there. He put together a squad that was able to be commercialized at a later date. And once you start looking at those specific factors, you can quite quickly narrow down the pool to fit the model of an ownership group or of a club based upon the requirements that they give you. So we have a database that we've built over several years, which lists every single player that that has arrived at a club under the watch of a sporting director and a head scout. And so then what we would do is go in. Once we see that a player was linked with a certain individual, we'd then go in and interview as many people as possible who'd been at the club at the time to really understand who had pushed that transfer and who had been the one who'd signed off on it and who'd been the one who was most interested in it.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, but if you look at if you look at the top leagues in Europe every season, and you look at the players that come into those leagues, it's actually less work than you think after a particular period of time.
How big is your team, Charles?
So we've got 3 people with me here in LA that do a lot of the data dissemination. But right now it's me that deals with the clients.
So how many people do you speak to on a weekly basis?
Hundreds. I mean,
wow.
We've got, usually during the week, I'd speak to between 10 and 20 people a day about various things. And obviously that's doing our marketing and doing our business development as well as working on behalf of clients that we already have. Okay,
well, listen, let me take it back to the hypothetical in the sporting director scenario. Once you have all of your information about these people, do you reduce that to a particular score? Like, can you tell a club, if you give them a short list and say this person at the top of the list meets most of the requirements that you've asked for and is therefore the best person, or are you offering them a short list and letting them make their own minds up after interviews and such?
No, we'd offer a short list, and if you can visualize a matrix, and let's say we had 15 different requirements that the club or that the ownership group had in hiring a sporting director, it would be easy for us just to even visually tick a box that for the particular discipline that sporting director satisfied. So we would take our clients through with that. The difficulty with assigning a score to the work of a sporting director is that it would have to be a different model for every client that we had, because every club would have slightly different nuances to it and slightly different objectives to it. So,
and what are those objectives, Charles? Like, what's a good example of a club's objectives if they're looking for a new sporting director? If you say there's 15 of them, what might 4 of them be?
Sure. Well, in most of the leagues, the top 4 or the top 3 or top 5 is usually fairly well defined at this point because of money. So you have a big scramble slightly further down the league for the rest of clubs to want to finish in a position of probably 12 and 6 or 12 and 5, something like that. And so in order to properly embed yourself in that spectrum, it's really important to be strong on player trading. And so that's normally the recruitment of post-academy players, so probably between the ages of 19 and 22, that can be bought fairly cheaply. So let's say you're in France and you're talking about Lille, for example. A lot of the time they might find a player who has not been rejected but not managed to find a lot of time at PSG, for example, and managed to acquire that player for fairly cheap and then sell that player on at a really high resale price a year or 2 down the line. So the model is much more about trading than it is about development or about buying the finished article. So that's one part. The other part is how, because of the way that the world is going right now, how savvy is this individual with technology or with data? So there are, broadly speaking, 2 types of sporting director at the moment. One is the guy who's got a great network and relies on recommendations from that network. And the other is probably someone who is employing statistics and employing probability models and different types of technology to supplement those things. The more favourable of the two for ownership groups now is more on the statistics and technology side. So those would be two that I would say right now are particularly in vogue.
Yeah, and how has that shift happened?
I think that there's more information available now to go on than there was 10 years ago, just by virtue of what's available, what's publicly available. But I think also a lot of the time now, clubs, and particularly clubs that aren't in that little coterie of elite clubs within their own country, it's incredibly hard for them to make any money through commercial success. So sponsorship deals or ticketing revenue, whatever it might be. And so often, a lot of the time, they'll run at a deficit. And the only real way to overcome that deficit and sometimes even make a profit is through clever player trading. And it's also a good way for owners to make money because that's something that they're going to make a lot more money from than getting the new shirt sponsorship deal. So I think whereas in the past a lot of clubs had this idea that commercial revenue would help it wash its face, I think people are realizing now that by employing a clever trading model, you're more likely to see good revenues.
Presumably, the key point with all of this is to achieve buy-in at ownership level, because one of the problems you see with clubs, whether it's with sporting director roles, as you've already said, kind of a maximum often 18-month tenure, or with management, it's the chopping and changing. And of course, that has an effect on recruitment. It has an effect on pathway to the first team, all of these different things that are instrumental in the way you're assessing the ability and the value that's given by these setups. So how do you find working with an ownership group that you haven't necessarily begun the process with? How do you go about achieving buy-in for that and convincing them not only is this your guy, but it's absolutely crucial that you stick with them and that you give them a significant period of time in order to develop these processes, because otherwise you're kind of wasting it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the key things with a lot of ownership groups is that a lot of them go into it because they want to make money. And so I think that if you can show those owners, if they're individuals, or those groups in general, evidence that person X has generated, X tens of million euros or pounds through the successful recruitment and resale of players, then I think that goes a long way to getting them excited. I think that the harder thing for incoming owners is to bet on a longer term project. And so if you look actually at a lot of the sporting directors who are having success now, a lot of them are young, a lot of them are in their mid-30s, early 40s, and a lot of them were specifically hired by bigger clubs because they've done such a great job at smaller clubs. So think, clubs like Sassuolo or, Atalanta are doing incredibly well now, but that's a fairly recent thing. So
and they grew up with Football Manager, right, Charles? Is that also true?
I think that might be part of it as well. Yeah. So I think with ownership groups and getting the buy-in, if you can persuade them that the insights you're giving them can not only save them money but increase their revenues, that I think is the first start. The other thing is that, and this is something that's specific to me, but I was lucky enough prior to setting up Retexo to work in a group that is an ownership group in American sports that owns the Dolphins and has a lot of interest in European football. And the exposure the understanding I gained from being part of that group, but also the exposure that gave me to other owners and would-be owners has been really helpful in knowing how to tailor my message to them.
How do you think the push of, for example, the Manchester City football group with their various clubs that they're owning, also perhaps more cogently what the Red Bull group are doing with Leipzig, not just being a success in its own right, but being the eventual destination of players from Salzburg who are themselves coming from FC Liefering. How is that model affecting what you're doing and how owners perceive the importance of those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think every owner now would like to have a multi-club portfolio, and a lot of what you read in the press about speculative owners are talking about recreating that But the fact is that what City have done, or what City Football Group have done, and what Red Bull have done, it takes a hell of a lot of planning and has to be very, very carefully structured and then integrated in order to see the results that they're both having now. I don't think that, and in fact, it's interesting looking at the differences between those two groups, where you've got one that started with, an absolutely enormous anchor club that has then built off using the word City as the brand with clubs in other countries. Red Bull didn't do that. They started with a pretty modest collection of clubs, and are managing to be competitive in the elite competitions. Maybe not to the same extent that Manchester City are, but in a completely different way. And their way is much more around the recruitment, development, and trading of players than it is around buying the finished article. So the similarities would be that they're both training up young players in their satellite clubs to theoretically one day push for a position in their main club. So I think that as multi-club ownership group goes, there are many different ways to do it and many different models that you can look at employing. I think that in how that affects us, it's an opportunity in some ways, because if you can convince the group that's central to that expansion that you've got a product or a potential partnership that's of interest, then you could theoretically roll that out over all the different assets that they have. But equally, it's a challenge because a lot of them tend to employ their own team of statisticians and of data analysts and like to keep things in-house. So it just depends on the vision.
But would you advocate, say you were retained by a large Premier League club that was interested in doing that, would you be part of a process that said, we've surveyed all the available clubs in Ligue 2, for example, in France, and we think that for reasons X, Y, and Z, you should go and buy that one? Is that part of conversations that you're having?
Absolutely. And so understanding what they hope to achieve and then looking at which clubs that are already in existence have the raw materials to get them to that point in short time and are at a price point that would be of interest to the ownership group. Absolutely.
Would you mind if we play a little game now, Charles? Let's say Alex and I had billions of pounds. Mm-hmm. Imagine just for a second. It's a wonderful thought. It really is. All the nice things we could do. But we want to buy a football club in. Where do you want to buy a football club, Alex?
I'd like to buy Sochaux in France.
No, don't say the club, because that's breaking. You've ruined the game.
Oh,
You've ruined it. Right, we're saying England, so it's a club that I will know. In England, Charles, we have billions of pounds to spend. We don't want to spend that much money, though. We've got £250 million that we would be willing to spend, and we're not, we don't have to buy a Premier League club, for example. But Alex's conditions are as follows. Alex?
I would like a good, strong youth academy, ideally a tier 1. I'd like a one city club, ideally, and I'd like to start to look to establish a satellite club as soon as possible.
Where do we go, Charles?
Well, I would say that just something off the top of my head, an interesting club to look at might be someone like MK Dons, because you're not looking at top tier, and especially in England, even Championship and certainly Premiership, the prices can be just so prohibitive. So that notwithstanding, I think MK Dons could be really interesting. You've got fairly good proximity to London. You've got a good youth system that's in place, and we've seen players come out of that Dele Alli and others who've graduated from that academy. And I think the facilities that they have there are absolutely fantastic. So I think that if you were to acquire a club like that, you've got a good catchment area, but you're close to London, which is a strange thing to say because not many clubs satisfy those two things. And I think that you've got a lot of the infrastructure in place to be fairly successful quite quickly.
What if I said that we didn't want to buy a club with a complicated history of fan engagement? You were about to say another one, though. You answered my question for me. Let's go.
Well, no, just another club that I think's been interesting. I mean, it might not be cheap, but I've always been pretty interested in Derby. I've been interested in the where they're based is a hotbed for player production and has been for a long time. They're pretty international for a club that hasn't played top flight football for a long time, and that they've had American owners and they've had American executives who've come through and I think helped them to put in place good business practices And they're certainly, well, actually, no, they're not a one club city, but more or less.
Oh, good. That was good. I think that was a good game. Can I ask you then, Charles? It sounds like you've worked with an ownership group before. You're obviously based in the States, and presumably you spend much of your time talking to people in those echelons. What are they like, football owners? I mean, let's go with American football owners specifically. But what do they tend to be like in your experience?
So usually they're people who've made their money in real business, let's say, and decide at some point that they would like to have a go at football. And there can be a lot of different reasons for that. Some of the time, those people have European business interests, and it's a good way of raising their profile in Europe. Some of the time, they love, they're because America's America. Some of the time, they'll have a grandfather that came from a city or a country, and they'll want to try and reconnect with their roots by buying the local club. They tend to be incredibly business focused. There's a lot less romanticism about it and a lot less reverence paid than would be from us probably to the history of these clubs and players that have been associated with them in the past, which I think in some ways is actually a really good thing, because maybe we get a bit too caught up in the nostalgia of things that have gone before. But I would say they're people who are normally billionaires, and I don't think you become a billionaire by being mild-mannered. So I think I would put it like that.
And have you spent much time talking personally to the billionaires, or do you tend to find yourself speaking to the billionaires' employees?
Both. I mean, usually the owner, the ultimate owner, will have someone who runs their businesses, who's more often than not the person that I'll liaise with. And they're often people who've come from finance backgrounds. But I've spent quite a lot of time as well with people that actually are the ultimate owner of clubs as well.
And I think you alluded to this already in your answer, but the time that you have spent, I mean, I'm sort of genuinely interested by the character and the personality of people who end up being billionaires. You sort of referenced what that might be like already, but I don't know. Can you say anything about the type of their personalities? Are they, in your experience, have you met any warm billionaires?
I've met some really nice ones. Yeah, I mean, I think that because the US is the way it is, and the size and scale of the market and business opportunities here, I think that there are people in the US that become billionaires that in England or in the UK, for example, might be multi-millionaires. And I think that's the difference. So I don't think those people are necessarily particularly different. It's just that what their success has led to is something on a much bigger scale. But I think that they tend to be people that are laser focused on a vision, much more high level thinking than perhaps on the granular detail of what it is that they're looking to achieve. And so that's why they tend to employ teams of people around them that would take on the day-to-day responsibilities and strategy of what will lead to the ultimate vision. So I would say, in short, very, very single-minded and big picture thinkers.
Did you read the psychopath test, Charles?
No, I haven't actually read it, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, I mean, it always makes me think of this whenever I talk about billionaires. But John Ronson talks about the percentage of billionaires, or the percentage of psychopaths within billionaires, being much higher than it is within the common community. Do you think you've ever met a psychopath, Charles?
Yes.
Okay, I won't ask you to go into any more. I think Alex has a question. We'll move swiftly on from your stories of psychopaths.
Yeah, I've got sort of two related questions. Firstly, I mean, you've already said that a lot of ownership groups will acquire a club with a genuine sense of turning a profit as being their ultimate objective. But that is notoriously difficult in football. And so first question would be, are there really actually other things? Are we still kind of in the local businessman vanity area of acquiring clubs? And secondly, with regards to American owners, someone like John Henry, for example, who's been very, very successful with Liverpool, he also has interests in other sports, including a NASCAR team, I think. So why is it that in America they kind of diversify across different sports more than I think perhaps they do with European ownership groups?
Yeah, well, John Henry also owns the Boston Red Sox, which which is one of the iconic sports franchises in the US. I think that there are two parts to that. I think that making money out of owning a football club can be done one of two ways. The first is that you do it the way Fenway have done, which I wouldn't say is short term because they've been the owners now for a while, but they've spent an enormous amount of money, or at least made available an enormous amount of money to Klopp and to people within the club who are responsible for buying players. Now, I know that is also because they've received huge transfer fees through selling players like Coutinho and several others, but they've been very free and trusting with their money. So I think that if you have an owner that's got pockets that deep, I think that's obviously a completely different story. Most owners that would curate a club are not people who are in that position. So I think in order to make money out of a club, if you're not in that situation, it's got to be a much longer term plan and probably at least a 5-year plan, because even if you restructure your academy, you're probably looking at a 5-year lag time before that starts bearing fruit. You need to get all the blocks in place, from having the right personnel to be able to execute against what it is that you're looking to achieve. So I think that those are the two different types of approach you could have, and obviously the second approach probably suits a mid-sized club more than it does one of the elite European clubs. The other thing you asked, which is interesting about being an ownership group with interest in different sports, I think that if and there are plenty of examples. I mean, Mr. Khan owns the Jacksonville Jaguars and Fulham, and there are many of those groups at the moment in the US that have those kind of interests. You've got the Glazers with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Manchester United, and the list goes on. I think that the attraction of that is if you can build an ecosystem, as they like to say, of sports, and then a group of service businesses around those sporting assets, you can create a very powerful marketing machine that perhaps can have a real estate play to it. If you're looking at building new stadiums or training centers, you can build technology businesses, you can build entertainment businesses and venue businesses. And I think that the more sports assets you have, the more international in scale you can make that operation, and the more cool things you can do around it with tangential areas to sports.
Charles, can I ask you some personal questions?
Yes.
Do you speak any other languages?
I speak decent Spanish and I speak a little Italian. I've got all my cousins on my dad's side are from Madrid, and I was born in South America, so my Spanish is decent.
Right, because it struck me when you were talking before about the ideal credentials of a sporting director. You mentioned how many different languages do they speak, which I makes such obvious sense that I'd never really thought about it before. Presumably, that's a sought after attribute.
It is, but especially with the Latin languages, there's a bit more leeway given there. I mean, I did a project last year for a separate project for Madrid where we appointed Zidane's fitness coach, and one of the requirements was that it had to be a speaker of a Latin language, so that if it wasn't Spanish, it would be easy for them to get up to speed on speaking Spanish day to day, but also someone who spoke French, because that's the nationality of his inner circle within the club. So we did a fairly extensive project. We actually ended up appointing a guy from the French Federation who'd been working with Deschamps during the World Cup winning campaign, who actually didn't speak any Spanish at all, but spoke fluent English and French. So the language thing is pretty important.
Oh, that's interesting. Also, as an observation, you speak very well generally. I'm sure you know that, and I imagine that's as a result of your experiences, maybe working in recruitment and stuff. Do you find that that's a very important facet of your job? If you need to sell something to the club, you need to be able to know what you look like, you know what you're talking about, or know what you're talking about, ideally.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying that. I've heard different things from different people. No, I mean, I think so. I think that to be able to be convincing in your actions, but then be convincing by backing up those actions through tangible statistics, I think is a powerful combination. And I hope is one of the reasons that we've won the work that we have.
Yeah. How did you get into this personally?
Well, so it was interesting. I felt that, so I mentioned that I've been in executive recruitment for a long time, and I don't know how much you know about that world, but the model is typically that a company or a club or whatever it might be will retain you on a project by project basis to find a certain type of person. And you usually get a portion of your fee up front, a portion midway through the project, and then a portion at the end. And my frustration had become that if you assume at such time as a search is commissioned by a company, that's by definition the conclusion of a strategic process internally for them to define exactly what it is that they're looking for. And the problem is that if you're just executing on that, you miss out on all that strategic planning, which I think makes it harder for you to sell the opportunity with complete credibility, but also gives you less context around why the company wants what it wants. So my idea became that, and also the other part of that is that there's very little context then around what people actually do before they come back with the short list of candidates. And what occurred to me was that I think if you can identify candidates more through the use of data and fact, I think that turns up a lot of people that wouldn't be on a typical shortlist for a particular job. But also, if you can help a company to plan strategically ahead of time, first of all, it's more interesting and you're involved in more of the process, but I think it gives you a much better understanding of what they need on the back end. And sometimes you can even change their mind as they're planning and say, I don't think that that's realistic. I don't think you can get that. Rather than having to carry the can for something not working out because you took on an assignment that ultimately was never going to work.
So you left that to start your own business?
Yes, yeah, I did.
How's it going? How do you feel? It's a scary thing to do, right?
It is, but actually, I think that it's a long term game. I think we've got an angle that I don't see anyone else using. I think we've got a track record of working with the types of clubs and groups that I think most people would love to work with, and I think we do great work with them. So it is a little different because you don't have all that security, but I think potentially the upside's a lot more exciting as well.
Okay. Well, Alex, do you have any more questions for Charles before we go?
No, I'm fully satisfied. Thank you.
I've never heard you say that before. Well, Charles, you've done something very strange to Alex here, but whatever it was, I'm going to listen back to this while I edit it and try to figure out how you've done that. Hey, listen, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It sounds like what you do is very interesting, and we wish you the best of luck with your venture.
Thank you both very much. I really enjoyed that.
Not at all. Listen, we'll be back next week with something and somebody else. Don't know what it is or who, but I'm sure it'll become apparent in the fullness of time. Goodbye.